What would you say to someone who thinks Obama's done the right thing by not trying harder to get Bernanke to serve a third term? The argument for that would be, as Ben Bernanke himself has argued, we do not want to create a cult of personality in monetary policy. We want to get the sense that multiple people could do this. 2 terms is enough. And it makes sense now to do someone else. Do you think that's right? Do you think it's good that the Fed will have a new leader, or do you think Bernanke should have had his arm twisted to serve a third term?
My view is that Ben Bernanke reinvented the Federal Reserve System. When they went through the crisis with AIG and so forth, I think that Ben Bernanke stepped up. Obviously, Secretary Paulson did a great job working with him. But when Paulson left and Tim Geithner came in, the Fed, on its own, reinvented itself. Remember, the Fed's purpose, when it was set up under Woodrow Wilson, was to make sure our currency wasn't debased and we didn't really have inflation too high, and we really had a strong currency. But the Fed has adopted the notion that its mission is to stimulate the economy. That really wasn't what the Fed was supposed to do. And the Fed decided, because Congress was dysfunctional, that the only game in town, the only way to get the economy going again and to get out of this, the worst part of the recession, was to stimulate the economy. The only way you could do it was QE1, QE2, and QE3. I think Ben Bernanke did a wonderful job there, but he didn't really want to be appointed the second time. In other words, he wanted 1 term. He realized that if he didn't get a second term, it would look like he was chased out of town. He would prefer, in my view, to have served 2 years and then left if he could have. Then the problems became bigger and he agreed to stay. I don't believe he had any interest in staying in a third term. The president could have articulated his interest in Bernanke and thinking how great he was, but I don't really think the president really wanted, I don't think Bernanke wanted a third term, and I don't think the president could have persuaded him to have one. You might know better.
I think I'm going to leave that subject. Okay. And I think what I'm going to focus on is something slightly differently, though it's your subject. I think the question of where we are in terms of Federal Reserve policy is actually a very difficult one. I totally agree with David. I think QE1 was absolutely critical to getting off the abyss. I agree with that. I think the QE3 is I think that's a much more difficult judgment to make. I agree with something David said. I think that surely commentators say that the justification for QE3 was the fact that our policy process wasn't working. I agree with that. But the right question is, or right question was, with respect to QE3, what are the costs going to be and what are the risks going to be? Or, I'm sorry, what are the benefits going to be and what are the risks going to be? I think most people think, most analysts think the benefits have been somewhat limited probably. Rates were very low before it started and so forth. Let's leave the debate about benefits aside, but I think that is a pretty broadly prevailing view at least. I think the risks are really quite, well, I'll say they're real. There was a moral hazard risk with our political system. There's the question, even if the bond market wasn't much affected by the Fed buying, and you can debate that one way or the other, but even if it wasn't, I think there is a broadly held, I know there's a broadly held view, that as you go out the risk spectrum, it has contributed to excesses because of a comfort that the Fed will continue on its present mode. By the way, even if it didn't affect the bond market too much in terms of creating low rates, I do think there's an asymmetry because of the psychology around the Fed, so that when they stop buying, and you've seen this in the last couple of months, I thought this was beforehand actually, that you were likely to get a spike up in rates. But the big risk, the important risk, and the one that could affect all of us, is how are they going to get out of this thing? And they have unprecedented size of balance sheet. They have unprecedented monetary conditions. Forget technically what's monetary base, one thing or another. Unprecedented monetary conditions. It is always very difficult for the Fed to figure out how to deal with rates so that they get the right path through tipping over into a negative place on the one hand and inflation on the other hand. And now they're going to have to do it with unprecedented size, with conditions that are unprecedented in terms of the size of the balance sheet and monetary conditions. And I think that creates enormous uncertainties. Yes, I think that creates enormous uncertainties and creates a very, very difficult challenge for the Fed and a set of risks that I've just articulated that I at least find quite troubling.
Okay.